My husband went on business trips with her female colleague while I was doing double shifts to keep up with the expenses of our house and son. Now he is begging at the door for me to reconsider. I sat at the tiny kitchen table, rubbing my temples as I tried to balance the bills for the month. The dim overhead light flickered slightly, casting a weak yellow glow over the pile of invoices and receipts scattered before me. My eyes stung from fatigue, my body sore from the double shift I had just finished at the diner. I glanced over at the clock, 2:14 a.m. I could still hear the faint hum of the dishwasher running, but the rest of the house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. In the next room, my 5-year-old son, Ryan, was asleep in his bed, his soft snores drifting through the thin wall. I let out a shaky breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I stacked the unpaid bills into a neat pile. No matter how hard I worked, I couldn't keep up. The mortgage payment was overdue, the utility bills were piling up, and I barely had enough to cover groceries for the next week. I ran my fingers through my unwashed hair, feeling the sting of tears threatening to spill. I had been carrying this burden alone for months. Alone, while my husband, Mark, was traveling for work, or so he claimed. I stared at my phone on the table, the screen illuminated with Mark's latest text message. Flight delayed again. Should be home by Friday. Miss you. Love you. I let out a bitter chuckle, the words twisting like a knife in my chest. I had believed his excuses at first. After all, business trips were part of his job, right? I told myself that he was working hard to provide, while I worked double shifts at the diner to keep us afloat. But I knew better now. I had seen the photos. I had read the texts. He wasn't on business trips. He was with her. Claire Parker, his colleague from work. It started with little things, the late-night calls he claimed were from clients, the extra trips tacked onto his travel schedule, the emotional distance that grew between us. At first, I didn't think much of it. I was too busy working overtime to pay attention to the warning signs. I was too tired to read between the lines. But one day, while I was cleaning up in our bedroom, I found it. A receipt from a hotel in Miami. The date matched one of his supposed business trips. I wouldn't have thought much of it, except for the extra room service charges listed on the bill. 2 entrees. 2 glasses of wine. 2 breakfasts the next morning. My chest tightened. But still, I shoved the suspicion aside. I convinced myself it was for a client. I wanted to believe him. I needed to, but then came the photos. My friend Emma, who worked in marketing at a nearby firm, sent me a message one evening with a link to a corporate event gallery. "Hey, isn't this Mark?" she had written. I clicked the link and my heart dropped. There he was, in a tailored suit, standing by the poolside bar. Claire stood beside him, wearing a low-cut cocktail dress, leaning just a little too close. In one of the photos, he had his hand on the small of her back. In another, they were walking away from the crowd together, laughing intimately. I stared at the photos for a long time. Feeling a dull, crushing numbness, I wanted to scream, to cry, to confront him right then and there, but I didn't. Instead, I simply closed the link, shoved my phone away, and went back to my double shift at the diner, because the bills weren't going to pay themselves. The next few months were a blur of exhaustion. I threw myself into work, determined to hold the house together for Ryan. I took on double and triple shifts, sometimes working 18-hour days just to make enough money to cover our expenses. My feet ached, my hands were raw and dry from constant washing, and I barely slept. Mark, meanwhile, was living a double life, pretending to be a hard-working husband, while whisking Claire away to resorts, hotels, and fancy dinners. I didn't confront him right away. I wanted proof, something irrefutable. So I gathered everything, screenshots of their texts, where she called him baby and he said he couldn't wait to see her. Emails they exchanged, arranging their weekend getaways. Photos from the corporate gallery, their arms around each other. I saved every single one. I was preparing for the inevitable, even though my heart shattered a little more each time I added another piece of evidence. The night I finally confronted Mark will be etched into my memory forever. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, silently observing, gathering every piece of evidence I could, while he carried on with his double life. I wanted proof so undeniable that even he wouldn't be able to weasel his way out of it. And now, the moment had arrived. It was a cold November evening, and the rain was drumming softly against the windows. Ryan had been tucked into bed an hour ago, his small face peacefully slack in sleep, unaware of the storm brewing downstairs. I sat in the living room, waiting. The folder of damning evidence sat on the coffee table in front of me. Inside were the screenshots of their flirty messages, the photos of them at hotels and corporate parties, and the receipts from their lavish dinners. The weight of it all settled heavily on my chest. I could feel my heart beating in my throat, but my hands remained steady. I had been angry for weeks, raging and grieving in private, bottling up my fury until it became cold and unyielding. Tonight, I would release it all. I heard the garage door creak open, followed by the slam of a car door. Mark entered the house with his usual nonchalant grin, brushing the rain from his hair. His tie was loose, and he carried his suitcase casually by his side, as if he hadn't just returned from a weekend of betrayal. He walked into the living room, his eyes lighting up with fake warmth when he spotted me. "Hey, babe," he greeted, walking over to kiss my cheek. His lips landed on air when I turned my head away. He pulled back slightly, his face momentarily wrinkled with confusion. "Everything okay?" he asked with feigned concern. Without answering, I stood up slowly and walked over to the coffee table. I picked up the folder of evidence and dropped it onto his lap. Mark blinked down at the folder, clearly puzzled at first. Then he began to flip through the pages. The smile slid from his face the moment he saw the first screenshot of his messages with Claire. "You were incredible last night. I can still feel your lips on me. Can't wait to see you in Miami, baby." His hands started to tremble slightly as he flipped through the rest, receipts from their shared hotel stays. Photos of them at a beachside bar, his hand possessively on her waist. The corporate gallery picture where his lips brushed her ear, their smiles far too intimate for mere colleagues. I watched his face drain of color, his eyes wide with disbelief. For once, he was speechless. What is this?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. I crossed my arms and stared him down, my voice cold and steady. "That's you and Claire, isn't it?" I tilted my head slightly, feigning confusion. "Or do you have another female colleague you enjoy screwing during your business trips?" His eyes snapped up to meet mine, filled with panic and desperation. "Babe, it's not what it looks like," he blurted, his voice cracking slightly. "Claire and it was just business." "The photos are just," I cut him off sharply, my voice like ice. "Just business?" I scoffed. I picked up the photo of them holding hands, pressing it against his chest. "You were holding hands on the beach. Was that business related, too?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't stop. I grabbed the receipt from the hotel and shoved it in his face. 2 glasses of wine. 2 breakfasts. 1 king-sized bed. My voice was low and deadly. "Tell me, Mark, was that for work, too?" His hands were shaking slightly, his eyes glossy with panic. "Jen, please," he pleaded, his voice suddenly choked with emotion. "It was a mistake. It meant nothing, I swear. It was just a stupid fling. I love you, I love Ryan. Please, we can fix this." His desperation rang hollow in my ears. I stared at him with nothing but disdain. Feeling a cold, dark satisfaction in watching him squirm. "Fix this?" I repeated bitterly. I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You want to fix this? While I was working double shifts to pay our bills and keep a roof over our son's head, you were living a fantasy with your whore." His eyes widened at the venom in my voice, and he staggered back slightly, as if the words had physically struck him. "I made a mistake, Jen," he choked out, tears threatening to fall. "I'll do anything." Please, let's go to counseling, let me make it right. I shook my head slowly. There was no sadness or anger in me anymore, just a deep, impenetrable calm. I had spent months mourning my marriage in secret. But now, I was done grieving. No, Mark, I said softly, my voice deadly even, you already made it right, when you gave me enough proof to walk away. The next morning, I packed a small suitcase for Ryan and me. I didn't waste time yelling or pleading with Mark. There were no dramatic fights, no tears, just cold, emotionless resolve. I drove to Emma's house, where Ryan and I would stay temporarily. She welcomed us with open arms, no questions asked. That afternoon, I met with a divorce lawyer. I handed over the folder of evidence, and she assured me that I had more than enough to win custody of Ryan. I filed for divorce the same day. Over the next few weeks, Mark fell apart. He called me repeatedly, begging and sobbing, but I didn't answer. He left dozens of voicemails, his voice cracking with guilt, filled with pleas and desperation. Please, Jen. I can't live without you. I'll do anything. I'll quit my job, anything you want. Don't take Ryan away from me. I didn't respond. I deleted them all without listening. When he finally showed up unannounced at Emma's house, pounding on the door, I calmly called the police. They arrived and escorted him off the property. The divorce proceedings were swift and decisive. The judge awarded me full custody of Ryan without hesitation. Mark's infidelity and neglect of his family responsibilities were undeniable. The house? Mine. The car? Mine. Full custody of Ryan? Mine. Mark was left with visitation rights, nothing more. As I left the courtroom, victorious but emotionally spent, I held Ryan's small hand in mine. He looked up at me with his bright blue eyes and smiled. Mommy, can we go get ice cream? He asked. I smiled down at him, tears of relief prickling in my eyes. Anything you want, baby, I whispered, and as we walked away from the courthouse, I finally felt free. The rain was relentless, drumming violently against the windows, and the howling wind rattled the shutters. Outside, the sky was pitch black, with only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the yard. The storm had been raging for hours, but inside my home, there was a different kind of calm, a peaceful stillness I hadn't felt in years. I sat on the living room couch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. Ryan was asleep upstairs, curled up with his favorite stuffed bear, oblivious to the storm raging outside. For the first time in weeks, I felt light. The divorce was finalized. I had full custody of Ryan, and Mark was out of our lives. The house was mine, legally and emotionally. No longer tainted by his lies and deceit, I had spent the past few days cleaning, purging the remnants of our life together. His clothes were gone, his photo frames removed, and even the mug he used for his morning coffee was thrown out. The house was now mine and Ryan's alone. It finally felt like a safe haven, one where his betrayal couldn't reach us. I stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the dark shadows of the trees sway violently in the wind. The storm felt symbolic, a final cleansing, washing away the last traces of Mark's presence. Or so I thought. The soft tapping at the door was barely audible over the sound of the rain. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. Thud. 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 I frowned, placing my tea down on the coffee table. No one was supposed to come by this late. I checked my phone, no messages. I stood slowly, walking to the front door, my feet light on the hardwood floor. As I reached for the handle, a gust of wind slammed against the house, making the door rattle violently in its frame. The knocking came again, desperate and rapid this time. I hesitated for a moment, then, with a deep breath, I pulled the door open, and there he was. Mark stood in the pouring rain, drenched from head to toe, his hair plastered to his forehead. The water dripped steadily from his clothes, forming dark puddles at his feet. His eyes were bloodshot, his face hollow and pale, as if he hadn't slept in days. His suit, the same one he had probably worn to impress Claire during their little trysts, was soaked and disheveled. The fabric clung to his shivering frame, and his tie hung loose and crooked around his neck. For a brief moment, I felt nothing but disgust. The pathetic sight of him was almost laughable, a broken man standing in the rain, ruined by his own greed and selfishness. "Jennifer, please," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper, hoarse and shaking. "Please, just let me in." His voice cracked on the last word, making it sound like a plea from a man teetering on the edge of desperation. He reached out slightly, his hand trembling from the cold and fatigue. "We need to talk," he stammered, his lips trembling. I can't. I can't do this without you. I'll do anything, Jen. Please." The rain pounded down on him mercilessly, drenching him further, but he didn't seem to care. He clung to the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely. I stood motionless, my hands gripping the doorframe tightly. For a brief second, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly snuffed out by the overwhelming bitterness in my chest. "Please, Jen," he choked out, his voice strained and broken. "I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I was an idiot. Please, you have to believe me. I never meant to hurt you. It just happened." He took a half step forward, but I stiffened, gripping the doorframe with a vice-like grip, blocking his path. He froze, blinking rapidly, as if realizing he had overstepped an unspoken boundary. "I love you," he whispered brokenly. "I love you and Ryan more than anything in the world. Please give me one more chance." I stared at him, my face impassive, my heart unmoved. The words, once so meaningful, now felt hollow. I had heard it all before, the promises, the lies, the pleading, but he wasn't done groveling. He dropped to his knees on the cold, wet concrete, his hands clutching at the doorstep. "I will do anything," he sobbed, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. "I'll quit my job. I'll never speak to Claire again. I'll go to therapy. I'll sign a prenup. You can have everything. Just please, don't shut me out." He was weeping openly, his face contorted with anguish, his voice hoarse with desperation. But the sight of him crumpled and broken before me brought me no satisfaction, only a deep, weary indifference. I crouched down slightly so that I was eye level with him. The rain splattered against the ground, creating tiny rivers along the pavement. I locked eyes with him, my voice low and steady. "You made your choice, Mark," I said, my tone emotionless. "You betrayed our family. You lied, you cheated, and you let me break myself working double shifts while you were on beach vacations with your mistress." His bloodshot eyes widened slightly at the venom in my voice, and his bottom lip trembled. "But I wasn't done. You didn't just hurt me, you hurt Ryan," I hissed. "While I was reading bedtime stories to our son alone, you were sipping champagne with Claire." His breath caught in his throat, and he let out a pitiful sob. "You can't just show up at my door and expect me to forget all of that," I spat, my eyes narrowing coldly. "You can't erase the nights I cried myself to sleep or the times I was too exhausted to stand in the shower after pulling double shifts." His face crumpled, and he let out a broken, strangled sob, but I didn't falter. I had no more tears left for him. I stood slowly, towering over him, watching as he clutched my hand, his fingers desperate and trembling. "Jennifer, please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't do this. I can't lose you. I can't lose Ryan." I pried his fingers off my wrist, one by one, and stared into his tear-filled eyes. "You already did," I whispered, and then, with a single, deliberate motion, I slammed the door shut in his face. I locked it, turning the deadbolt with a resolute click, and walked away without looking back. Outside, he was still pounding on the door, his voice breaking into hoarse cries, but I didn't care. I walked into the living room, picked up my lukewarm tea, and sat down calmly as if nothing had happened. As the rain continued to pound against the windows, I took a slow, steady sip and smiled faintly. Mark was gone from my life, and he was never coming back. Mark was gone from my life, and he was never coming back.